obtain loans that he wouldn't otherwise qualify for. I'm bringing that up.
Okay, people. Hopefully, this is good and we got it working now. Okay, silent voice. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Can you see a stuff story about White Island eruption? I am seeing a message from silent voice. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Waving my hands. I think everything should be working. Yep, it's all working. Great. Okay. No, a Mary Burger says no. Can you hear me? Can you see me? What's going on? Coming through loud and clear. It's not working. Slight delay in the UK. Meriburger says it's not working. Well, I'm going to just press on regardless. And hopefully you guys can see that. Okay, silent voice says all good. All right, so this tweet I sent the other day, actually the 1st of December. Oh, hey, lady Steph C. Great, you can hear me. Okay, so 60 minutes. So Australia's 60 minutes is kind of like the US 60 minutes that they do deep, in-depth investigations, and they do have some pretty good journos a lot of the time. They've broken some pretty big stories over the years, and they're quite good in particular, I think, on the regional issues. So Australia is kind of in the middle of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today is to do with the Pacific Ocean. Trouble. So can you guys just let me know if you can see this and hear this clip coming through okay?
In paradise, nations in the South Pacific are sick of us simply thinking of them as sunny playgrounds for postcard holidays. Many have significant problems which threaten their very existence. In the last few months, Scott Morrison has been trying to convince leaders around the Pacific that Australia is looking out for them and wants to help. But the Prime Minister isn't receiving much thanks in return. And that's because China is on the march and seems prepared to splash more of its cash in the region. How it's doing that, though, as we discovered, is alarming, at times sinister. Right now in the Pacific, seeing red has a lot of people seeing red. 2 months ago, the Pacific nation of Kiribati switched its allegiance from Taiwan to Communist China.
Right, so I'm not going to play the whole 60 minutes thing. I'll probably get a strike for that. But that's sort of the backdrop of what I want to talk about today is like these moves of the Chinese in the region. So let me start with this volcano in New Zealand that you guys have probably heard about this. So It's pronounced Whakaari, I believe, or White Island. It's erupted, and there's 8 people so far confirmed dead, and there's a number that are still missing. I think at least six still missing. There were 47 on the island at the time of the volcanic eruption. So I think it's probably right if I play like 20 seconds of this video from stuff here. All right, so New Zealand's most active volcano, and it's visible from the mainland. You look out, you can see this island, and you can see the plume of smoke coming out of it. So, my life, I'm used to this volcano erupting. It's something that it's an active volcano, so it does go off from time to time, just like the volcanoes in Hawaii. But this eruption looks like the biggest thing that I've ever seen. It's pretty gnarly and unfortunate for these people that passed away. Now, at the same time, there's also big disasters going on in Australia. So this tweet is from November the 12th, right? So that's quite a lot, a month ago now. But there were fires were going in Australia, and when the Amazon rainforest went up in flames, and you probably heard a lot about that, it burnt 125,000 hectares. But so far this year, Australia's lost 970,000 hectares and climbing. And I don't know what the total is today, but there's still big fires going on in Australia today. Here. So, oops. So this is like a crisis map of Australia from Google, and it tells you all the sort of the weather and fire hazards that are going on, emergency warning fires and everything. So as you can see, there's stuff going on, all across the country in Australia. And it is summertime here; it's sort of bushfire season. Oh, damn it. Okay, Guardian, no thank you. Former fire and emergency chiefs push for National Bushfire Emergency Summit. So they're saying that we need to have a big national conversation. We need to bring farmers, councils, military and politicians all together in Australia to talk about this growing problem that we have of these bushfires. And it's being attributed to climate change, of course. Because we have a changed climate, now we have all these really bad fires. Now we're going to have to come together and do new stuff in new ways to fight these terrible fires, which are a result of climate change. And it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So the Prime Minister has rejected calls for additional help for volunteers. And then when he was asked how they expected that tens of thousands of volunteers will continue fighting these fires without any pay, the Prime Minister said they want to be there. So that's pretty harsh, right? That shows you a bit about how things get done down in Australia. But 2 fire chiefs, one from the state of Queensland, one from New South Wales, saying we need a national summit. A coalition of former emergency leaders saying that we have to do more to address the climate crisis. I mean, you can kind of sense the underpinnings of, the UN Agenda 2030, the global progressives, the Podesta crew that he comes down here and meets with all these different progressives, and then all of a sudden there's all this climate change related stuff going on. So I don't know if Greg Mullins from New South Wales, the fire chief, is related to Paul Mullins, the psychiatrist, but that would be an interesting connection worth digging into a bit. And then they're bringing in the Red Cross and religious organisations supporting local communities. So the fires in New South Wales have had, on average, 2,000 firefighters a day working on it. So that's wearing them out before Christmas time and everything. Australia has a formidable emergency management capability, spent more than $5.5 billion on fire and emergency services across Australia and New Zealand last year. 290,000 personnel, and thousands of specialist vehicles. So, yeah, this is a big problem in Australia. They used to dealing with it, but it does seem to be getting worse. So then the next thing I want to show you, and you probably might be familiar with this. This is a Department of Defense briefing by William Cohen. William S. Cohen was the Defense Secretary, right? And this is April 28th, 1997. And he is asked, the question is, let me ask you specifically about last week's scare here in Washington and what we might have learned from how prepared we are to deal with that, brackets, inaudible, at B'nai B'rith. So B'nai B'rith is like the sort of, Jewish Freemasonry kind of organisation. Jerome Corsi's been associated with that, raising funds for them to invest in Israel. So that's the question specifically about that, which I think is interesting because you don't normally hear that when you hear the answer, which you probably will be familiar with. But I'm going to give you the full answer from William Cohen. Well, it points out the nature of the threat. It turned out to be a false threat under the circumstances. But as we've learned in the intelligence community, we had something called, we have James Woolsey here to perhaps even address this question, about phantom moles. The mere fear that there is a mole within an agency can set off a chain reaction and a hunt for that particular mole, which can paralyze the agency for weeks and months and years even in a search. The same thing is true about just the false scare of a threat of using some kind of a chemical weapon or biological one. There are some reports, for example, that some countries have been trying to construct something like an Ebola virus, and that would be a very dangerous phenomenon to say the least. So countries have been constructing the Ebola virus. Yeah, of course. Like, where do you think that thing comes from? And not even just necessarily countries, but like the Gates Foundation, big organizations, these sort of tax-exempt, transnational corporations that have multi-billion-dollar budgets. That's who seems to be right into stuff like these Ebola viruses, Zika virus being linked with the Rockefeller Foundation, for example. I see a question there from Silent Voice in the chat. Crypto Beast, did you know that DARPA is actively seeking natural underground caverns that can be quickly turned into cities? Yes, I did hear about that. That was like an urgent request from DARPA, like by the end of this weekend, or at the end of this week, we need to have some underground cities and bases that we can train in and do experiments in. And militaries all around the world are training primarily for fighting in underground facilities. So what the hell is out there in those underground facilities? The Outer Light is one channel that's done some good stuff on that. I might get into that another time. But coming back to this William Cohen quote, and we're getting up to the bit that you would have heard about before, but he's saying that countries can construct Ebola virus. Alvin Toffler has written about this in terms of some scientists in their laboratories trying to devise certain types of pathogens that would be ethnic specific so that they could just eliminate certain ethnic groups and races. Okay, so this is the US Defense Secretary talking about, scares and threats, and particularly like a terrorism threat directed at the B'nai B'rith, and he starts talking about race-specific bioweapons to wipe out certain races, or to afflict certain races with disease where other races are immune to that disease because of the genetic engineering of the virus, right? So this is very real and very scary stuff to me. And others are designing some sort of engineering, some sort of insects that can destroy specific crops. So this is biblical stuff, like plagues of locusts. And, Bill Gates he loves to do his trick with mosquitoes. He's got like a jar of mosquitoes. He's like, we're just going to let all these out in the room now. And, some of them have got a terrible deadly virus and some of them have got nothing. And, you'll never know which one it is that bites you. Well, that's kind of freaky. Like, who would even joke about something like that, let alone someone who comes from a eugenicist family whose father was a founder of Planned Parenthood and president of it for decades, personal friends with Margaret Sanger, right? And so they're doing this research and releasing these insects and developing them, right? and I'm sure DARPA and other groups are as well. And it's not necessarily to spread disease. It's, as it says here, it's destroying specific crops, right? Or infecting specific crops with a race-specific bioweapon, right? And here we go. Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism where they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. So, and here's the final part of the answer. So there are plenty of ingenious minds out there that are at work finding ways in which they can wreak terror upon other nations. It's real, and that's the reason why we have to intensify our efforts. That's why this is so important. So 1997, the US Secretary of Defense is saying in his, it's a Department of Defense news briefing. Oh, it was his keynote address at the Conference on Terrorism, Weapons of Mass Destruction, and U.S. Strategy at the Georgia Center, Mahler Auditorium, University of Georgia. So he's doing it, around the Georgia Guidestones and all that stuff. So this stuff is real. Now, moving on, and this is really what triggered me to want to do this whole stream today. So one of my sources sent this in. They didn't want to be named. Fair enough. But it's a fascinating story. Rainmakers. China will move clouds and make it rain in different places using satellites in terrifying weather control plan. The revelation confirms years of strange rumors that China might be meddling with the world's weather. Shall we watch it? Yeah, alright, let's try.
To ensure stability in its agriculture sector, China is not leaving things to Mother Nature. The Chinese government is planning to employ upgraded weather control systems in Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning, the three provinces responsible for 54% of the nation's rice production. The project, which will continue until June, involves creating artificial rain using cloud seeding, special aircraft, rockets, and much more. China has been tinkering with the idea for years. But how controllable can the weather be? Skeptics fear the consequences of meddling with nature at this level could be dire.
Right on. So, yeah, this is a pretty massive scale of the Earth that they're talking about it, and China already diverted the Three Rivers Dam, which did have a measurable impact on the Earth's rotation speed and its wobble from putting so much water into one place on the planet. So they're not above geoengineering, regardless of the consequences. This is saying 6 satellites make a ring to spot clouds that have water in them, and then they create an atmospheric corridor that lets them move the water to arid regions. So they're superheating the atmosphere, right, to create this corridor for the rain to move into. And it's called Tianhe, which translates as Sky River, developed by the Shanghai Academy of Spaceflight Technology. And it's going to be launched next year, right? So if it's going to be launched, that means that it's got to be in development testing. They're working out what this thing does right now. So as I understand these HAARP technologies, and I'm not saying I'm an expert on it, I'd point you to geoengineeringwatch.org, which is the best site on that for all the patents and everything like that. But I've certainly studied a lot of that stuff. And, basically it's an ionospheric heater. So by heating certain sections of the atmosphere with focused microwave energy, they can redirect weather, rain clouds, stuff like that. Right, so we have this as HAARP, they have this as Tianhe Sky River. And the idea of controlling the weather is far from new in China. In 2008, the country seeded clouds with silver iodide to ensure they rained away from the Beijing Olympics. So everybody knew that they were doing weather control for the Olympics, and the weather was great during those Olympics. And not only that, I've only been to Beijing once. It was 10 years before the Olympics, so perhaps it's cleaned up. But it was a very polluted place, but they shut down factories and things like that, and they made sure that in all the Olympic video, the air looked clear and clean, and there wasn't a haze of pollution around there. So Countries at the size and scale of China or the United States, Russia, Australia even, they can make decisions for themselves which can actually have effects on the whole planet's weather systems and everything. So they're trying to push 5 billion cubic meters of rainwater a year to the Yellow River Basin, which I guess this is a photo of it here. Looks like parts of the United States, looks pretty arid. The chief designer of the satellite said the orbiters would be equipped with devices dedicated to measuring temperature and humidity in the atmosphere and moisture levels in clouds. So I think I've got another story too on the Chinese. Yep, here we go. China's giant ionosphere zapping radar is a defense system masquerading as a science. So this is their radar system, these big antenna arrays, ground-based, and the plans were revealed for one on the island of Hainan, China's southernmost point. A high-powered, incoherent scatter radar that will bounce radio waves off Earth's high-altitude layer of charged gas called the ionosphere. So, although the project is in step with the country's other mega science projects, like planning the world's most powerful particle accelerator, the largest radio telescope, and the nuclear fusion finish line. There's been a lot of talk lately, chatter about nuclear fusion now being perfected, which is over unity energy sources, which supposedly, solves all the world's energy problems and removes the need for hydrocarbon, fossil fuel-based energy. But I think that the nature of the world's energy use is so vast and complex, it's not going to change overnight because of one breakthrough technology, but it will change over decades or centuries around breakthrough technologies. So America's least secret weapon, the possible military benefits of an ionosphere radar, isn't lost on other countries, especially the US. The Navy and DARPA ran HAARP in Gakona, Alaska, before it was passed on to the University of Alaska in 2014. It was sold as a project focused on studying the ionosphere, but the 40 acres of antennas featured prominently in conspiracy theories, of course, involving government-sanctioned weather control, human-made earthquake and tsunamis, and general mental disruption through a region. And so there's a photo, I guess, of the US HAARP facility in Alaska. So these things are actually all over the world. You see that picture there. So this is just an image, Australia over China, sort of giving you a picture of the relative size of the two countries or two continents. I guess China's not really a continent. Australia, I think most Australians think of it as a continent, so we'll claim it. New Zealand, we're on the 8th continent, the newly discovered sunken continent of Zealandia. It's an interesting story that I'll get into one day. But Australia's area is 7.7 million square kilometres, and China is 9.6 million square kilometres. So not that difference in size, but Australia has 21 million. I think that's more like probably 24 million now. China has 1.32 billion people. So, you can see why a country with all those people and a big amount of land would be looking at this country with a similar amount of land and really very few people and thinking, what can we do? And why are there so few people in Australia? Well, there's no water. It's almost entirely, like 90% of Australia's population is down the right-hand side, the east coast, because there's a mountain range there that creates regular rainfall, and they have water. And then to the west of that mountain range, across most of the continent, it's pretty much flat, and it's pretty much desert, and it's really, really dry. And they have developed water for cattle and things like that. So there sort of is water available over the country. But to support Chinese levels of population in Australia, you would need to have massive change of that desert into, land where it rained quite a bit. So if China has this technology, would they be looking at Australia and would they be thinking, we got to get us a piece of that? All right, so I'm going to pull up a few more articles now. Hold on. So anyway, what I hope I just establish quickly with those two articles, scanning through them, is that China and the US both have this capability of modifying the weather and moving like clouds around to make, rain go in the deserts and stuff like that. So China owns less than 1% of Australia's agricultural land, according to Treasury Register of Foreign Ownership. Now, this was in 2016. And then Chinese company Dakang bid $370 million for S. Kidman and Co., this is Nicole Kidman's family, right? So they're actually among the largest landholders in the world. And Scott Morrison, who's the Prime Minister of Australia now, he was the Treasurer then, and he blocked the sale. He said it was contrary to the national interest. Okay, and so the total foreign ownership of agricultural land in Australia is at 13.6%, with about 1% going to China. And you can see state by state how much land the foreign investors have. 8.8 million hectares in Western Australia. I think that's roughly about 20 million acres. 15 million hectares in the Northern Territory, which is not a state, it's a territory. Australia has two territories, Northern Territory and Australian Capital Territory, where Canberra is located. These are special zones. They're not, it's like District of Columbia, Vatican City, the District Federale in Mexico City. All around the world are these special zones that don't actually fit in the regular system of governing of the world. And Australia has two of them. One of them in the Northern Territory, 30% of the ownership of that special zone is from foreigners. And Victoria, where I lived in Melbourne, 600,000 hectares. It's still a lot, 5%. 21% of Tasmania is pretty much entirely agricultural land, and beautiful national parks and stuff. So 21% of that is owned by foreign interests, right? And the thing is, the appetite is unlimited. Australia has not really a lot of money. It has a lot of people who would like to get rich. And China has a lot of money and a lot of people who are already rich and would love to come to Australia and make Australians rich. And so as a result, this region, Australia and New Zealand, is experiencing great economic prosperity through a real estate boom of these foreign overseas buyers coming in and being able to get visas where they have a certain number of assets to invest. Then that lets them get a visa to come to stay and to own property and stuff like that. So in total in Australia, 385 million hectares of agricultural land. And this is like some of the stuff that we're talking about, these cattle stations where to go to your mailbox, you have to fly in your plane for 2 hours, The top 5 overseas owners of Australia, UK 7.1%. So I wonder how much of that is like Crown interests. US 2%, so that's the next. Netherlands 0.77%. And Singapore, in fact, being higher than China. So I'll move on. I don't want to just drown you guys with statistics, but it's sort of an interesting story about Nicole Kidman's family being revealed as one of the world's largest landowners. The Queen's number 1, I talked about that on my show the other day. But the Australian actress, which is actually her family, not her personally, but she comes from a family who are very large landowners. It's the size of Hungary, the amount of land they have, or they just sold some of it. But the Kidmans had 24 million acres, which is 4.5 times the size of Wales, making them the 8th biggest landholder in the world, and the largest private non-monarchical, non-state landholder in the world. Remember the other day I showed you guys the Pope was number 3, the Queen's number 1, the King of Saudi's number 2. It's basically royalty, and then the Kidmans coming in at number 8. So they came to Sydney in 1842, went and worked as agricultural labourers, so probably, indentured servants, possibly maybe criminals. I'm not casting aspersions, it's just that's part of the colonisation of Australia, and when you live in New Zealand, you like to frequently remind your Australian brothers or cousins that a lot of criminals were involved in the founding of their nation. That sort of makes it the great place that it is today. The Queen has 6.6 billion acres. Nice. So I don't know if you can see that map of Australia there with the red dots in the centre of it and at the top of it. That's these cattle stations. I mean, it's just some of these individual properties look the size of entire countries or states. And then there's this whole story that the Kidmans were selling their land off, and so the Chinese wanted to get in on this, right? And this is kind of a part of the story as well, like the old money of Australia, and not just the Kidmans, but also James Packer, who was the richest man in Australia. His dad, Kerry Packer, was like a media magnate, big into racehorses, cricket, international gambling whale, like possibly the greatest gambling whale who ever lived, although I'm sure these days he's been eclipsed by others. But as someone who's a very famous billionaire for his gambling and his exploits, but also owned massive amounts of land, massive. And James Packer sold that land off as well. I think I've got some stats on that coming up a bit later. But here's just some more detail on the Kidman holdings. Like one property area 4,800 square kilometres, one 5,500, 4,400, 8,910 square kilometres. 7,510 square kilometres, 13,552, 14,800, 8,877. I mean, this is just absolutely insane. So you give them this land, and if there's just recently been a fire and the cows had to be moved, or you lost a bunch of cows in the fire or whatever, you can see how the value of the land drops if there's been a drought, if it's been a very hard time for farmers, and the yield of the farm is a lot lower than it has been at peak times. Then it wears you down, and farming's a hard life. It encourages you to sell. So this article is saying that there's a nasty split amongst the cattle king, Sir Sidney Kidman's descendants. Selling off their 116 pastoral empire. A lot of the family says, "Are you crazy? Don't do it." Others want the money. There's 185,000 beef cattle as part of this, and they were in talks with London-based private equity company Terra Firma, which owns rival big beef cattle business Consolidated Pastoral. So that's the one that bought Packer's land, who, as far as I know, is not the Chinese. I'm not sure. I'm not going to speculate on who is behind that, but I do point out that Terra Ma, which Ma being the sea, Terra being earth, so Terra Firma is the land. So Terra Ma, would be the Earth's sea. That was the name of Ghislaine Maxwell's charity, Epstein's handler, pimp, whatever you want to call her, girlfriend. So Sydney's descendants have 98% of the stock of this company, with 100,000 square kilometres of land, produces 15,000 tonnes of beef, tonnes not tonnes, which is 1.3% of Australia's boxed beef exports. And then last year it made 9.3 million and paid dividends of 2.36 million. So a multi-generational family after 118 years. There's a lot of them. There's grandkids and stuff. That 2.36 million, you can see it getting split pretty far, right? Like it's not a lot of money in this cattle business. If you've got 100,000 square kilometres of land, you've got, what did I say, 150,000 cows. Oh, here you go, 182,350 head. And the cows are worth 100 million, it says, or 97.4 million, but it makes 9.3 million, 2.36, that's kind of like a bit of a sucky business to have that much land, and the amount of money you're getting from that much land at the end of the day is really pretty small. And this is just maybe an aside, but something that I learned from a friend of mine who's in the food business is, and talking about being a vegetarian, and I like to eat meat, I like to eat steaks, and cows take up a huge amount of land. And so if everyone stopped eating cows and became vegetarians, and gave up dairy, so we didn't need them for milk either, then it's not like the cows are just going to roam around free, in their paddock with this massive amount of land for them. The land's going to be given over to other more productive uses, right? So where will the cows go? There'll be nowhere for them to go, because to provide that much land for a cow will be a luxury suddenly rather than a business. So if you like there being lots of cows on the planet, you kind of have to support eating meat, because if you support never eating meat, cows are going to go the way of tigers and rhinoceroses, Anyway, just a bit of an aside on that. But the Kidman family, some of them want to sell, some of them don't. Nicole probably doesn't need to sell. But isn't that interesting that Tom Cruise, Scientologist, married into this family, and then Jamie Packer, who was their rival landholder selling his interest, he got right into Scientology with Tom Cruise as well, and with Mariah Carey, I believe, she was into the Scientology too. So that's kind of interesting. And then the sale was approved to Gina Reinhardt, who is a coal and iron ore baron. Her father was a prospector, and she's Australia's richest woman, multi-billionaire. And so her and a Chinese company get to buy the empire. So Reinhardt's company will own 67% of it, and then Shanghai CRED will have a 1/3 minority stake through their joint venture company, Australian Outback Beef. So what could be more Australian than Australian Outback Beef? Well, that's a Chinese company. So there you go. That's how all that ended up. And so Gina Reinhardt is extremely tied into China economically, and I'm sure will be a good partner for them strategically in that. And then James Packer might look wistfully at Terra Firma's giant farm sale. So he sold his thing to Terra Firma, and now Terra Firma's being sold on the private equity market behind a paywall. That one, unfortunately. China is now, this is 2018. Remember when I said before it was 2016, it's probably gone up. So yep, they now ahead of the UK, and they're the biggest foreign owner in Australia. So foreign ownership steady at 13.4%, but the Chinese investment, and coming out of Hong Kong too, has absolutely jumped. An increase of more than fourfold in a year. And then China and Hong Kong together have 10.4 million hectares. The UK has 10.2 million hectares. And then Bahamas-linked groups, Bahamas, Cayman Islands, the shadow banking system, they have interest in 2.2 million hectares. So, a lot of offshore, I would say Bahamas-linked groups probably means landowners where you don't actually know who the real landowner is, right? That's who's buying up Australia. That's who's got the money. And so to be a foreign person, you have to be an entity with at least 20% foreign ownership. And then 92% of the foreign-owned land is actually held with an Australian incorporated local entity. So it's an Australian company owning the land, and then the foreign company owns the shares in the Australian company. And then here we go, 2017, they're saying, so some of these statistics are varying over time, but this is more than the 2018 one. But now China owns 14 million hectares of Australian farmland, which is 2.5% of all agricultural land in Australia. So if this land is not productive, they are buying it up on the cheap. And this is a 2019 story, I think, from the Daily Mail. From farms and coal mines to airports and water supplies, how China is gobbling up millions of acres of land, vital infrastructure and companies as part of its disturbing plan to exert greater influence and control over Australia. And it's not just Australia, it's the whole Indo-Pacific region, with Australia being this bridge between Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. Hi Amy, hi Teenage FBI Live, Slick Dissident, Dendrite XI, Jassy Joe, Ripper Fellows, Purple One, nice to see everybody there. Okay, I'll keep going. Just a time check. Are we good? So there are reports that China's tried to put a spy in Parliament. I mean, China. We know that they had a Dianne Feinstein's driver for 20 years was a Chinese spy. So it's very likely that wasn't just like at one time in the entire 5,000 or 6,000 year history of China, some bright spark sitting in some cubicle thought, I know, let's hire someone to be a driver of a prominent politician. No, this is obviously how they operate, right? And they're good at it. And so they've got spies everywhere, plugging into this stuff everywhere. And recently there was a whole bunch of hacking on the Australian Parliament, a serious cyber attack. And it was attributed to the Chinese, except for Allah High Priest, the infamous Peter Priest of Isaac Cappy fame. He came in to claim credit personally for the attack. Now, I've seen some speculation on Twitter in recent days that possibly, was he doing that to actually provide cover for the Chinese, to give them some plausible deniability? It wasn't us cyber attacking you, Australia. It was this LARPer. Look at this LARPer, Of course it was him. Look, he's got uranium, I don't know. Anyway, China has poured billions into Australia. They won't stop meddling in Australian domestic politics. They own an airport in Western Australia. This one says 9 million hectares. Well, I'm going to go with 14 million hectares. I think it's going to be more rather than less, right? They own the port of Darwin. They own the port and several Australian coal mines and wind farms. So even the renewable energy infrastructure is getting owned by these guys. Why? They're buying up Australian land, infrastructure and businesses at an alarming rate, seeking to project power and influence beyond their shores. Okay, I just read all that stuff. Well, here's a nice little map of some of the things they have. So Merredin Airport in Western Australia, Yakkamunga and Mount Elizabeth stations, Port of Darwin, Cubby Station in Queensland, Coal and Allied Mines, New South Wales, Bellamy's Organic in Tasmania. My kid was having that baby formula, really nice stuff. And yeah, that got bought for, I think, $1.2 billion, a Tasmanian company. It's a big deal for a tiny place like Tassie. So they're snapping it up. And what I hear is that there's great demand within China for things from New Zealand and Australia. Our food, our water, our produce, even our air is actually being packaged up and sold in China. You can buy fresh New Zealand air for like $20 or something. So there's demand, there's money, it's happening. The government's saying, come on down. Local pilots are saying they've never been turned down when they requested to land, but in theory the Chinese could. It says here, wholly owned by Chinese Southern Airport. And they paid $1 to lease the aerodrome for 100 years. What's going on there, right? The Port of Darwin was a $506 million bid for a 99-year lease, which, if you think about it, that's actually pretty cheap amount of trade that can be done in a port for 99 years. And so now that this is, if the Chinese wanted to have any kind of military action in Australia, they have to get their tanks and their planes and everything like that to the mainland, right? So owning a port in the northern part of Australia that's closest to them would obviously really facilitate that. And this is what this land looks like, the Australian outback. If you've never been there, it's not completely barren. There's actually trees. There's trees everywhere, and there's kangaroos jumping around. There's just no water. So without water, you can't grow the crops. So it needs massive scale, infrastructure, canals, or geoengineering, to solve these problems and to turn this land into like really productive farmland, if that indeed is the goal. So between 2017 and 2018, Chinese companies, so there's also Chinese private investors, it's not being measured in this, and there's a lot of Chinese private investors buying real estate in Australia and New Zealand. They added 50,000 hectares to their Australian property portfolio. The Treasury say that it's important for growth. So Shanghai Cred, which owns Zenith Australia Group, nice Aussie sounding name, doesn't sound Chinese at all, does it? That owns 7 properties, including Yakima, Mount Elizabeth, Marvel Lock, and Goldfields Station. And this is an interesting one. Size of foreign land interests by source country for Australia. So South Africa's actually got a lot. Philippines has got stacks. Saudi Arabia, Switzerland's got stacks. Canada, Switzerland and Canada have about the same. And if you put Philippines and Saudi together, that would be about the same. The Netherlands, wow, Netherlands has a lot. Now, the Netherlands can actually be a tax haven like the Bahamas as well. So possibly something there, but possibly that's some royal type of thing. And the UK at the top. So I don't imagine that the Queen needs to register in Australia as a foreign owner because it's her country. So I would say that in addition to that, UK ownership of land would be the royal interests. But I'm not sure about that. Don't quote me on that. Please do your own research and let us know if you find anything. Another dairy deal, $600 million to acquire Lion Dairy, which makes Big M and Dare, if you're familiar with those in Australia, and also Yoplait, Vitasoy, Pura, and Farmers Union. So the Aussies and Kiwis are keeping their beer companies and they're selling their dairy companies, which is very interesting. Wind energy, 110 million. I made a bit of money in wind investing in Australia before. It's a good sector. Yang Coal and Allied from Rio Tinto for $3.5 billion to become Australia's largest thermal coal mining company. So billions of dollars coming into the coal in Australia, just like we saw the other day in the United States as well. And then we've had a few deals that they've knocked back. So they've said that Huawei can't be part of the 5G network in Australia for national security grounds. Alexander Downer from the Spygate scandal, he was actually on the board of Huawei. $13 billion bid for natural gas, knocked back because of concern of foreign ownership in gas transmission. Half of the electricity distributor Ausgrid, that's an incredible strategic asset. Like, I really hope they don't sell that. They'd be absolutely nuts to sell the grid, the electrical grid of your country to another country. Like, that's crazy, right? What would anybody do that for? 10 billion? It's not worth it for $1 trillion. And then they rejected a bid for the Kidman. So yeah, as we saw, that deal did go through, but to Australia and Chinese interests. And then 1.75 billion for minerals companies. China is the largest foreign stakeholder of Australian water. It owns 1.9% of all of the water on the market, an amount bigger than Sydney Harbour. 732 gigalitres. Americans have 720. So China's beating America in terms of their ownership of Australian water. And then British have 414. So that's about 5% between China, America, and Britain. 5% of Australian water is owned by foreigners. The figure raised concern that Chinese companies are deliberately buying water as part of a state strategy. I mean, you think, right? You think? And land as well. And so this Cubby Station, that they bought this, it's a cotton farm owned by a textiles company, but it has the largest share of water rights in Australia, right? So they paid the price for the cotton farm, but did they pay the price to get those water rights? New Zealand's in the list. We own a bit. That's good. Yeah, and then all these schools opening up around Australia, teaching Mandarin, and the teaching assistants have to be completely loyal to the Communist Party and never speak out against it. So this is like a propaganda kind of invasion. Chinese agents offered Bo Nick Zhao $1 million to run as a candidate for a federal seat in Melbourne, a 32-year-old luxury car dealer. And then he disclosed it to ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, and then he was found dead in a motel room in March. So, yeah, big scandals going on. And in fact, that 60 Minutes story that I sort of began this piece with is talking about similar amounts of money that they're paying $1 million to these island nations in the South Pacific to switch their vote and to say that we don't recognise Taiwan as an independent nation. So, they're just running around handing these sort of bribes out. This isn't just a cash in a bag given for favours. This is a state-sponsored attempt to infiltrate our parliament using an Australian citizen, basically run them as an agent of foreign influence in our democratic system. It's really significant. Australians should be very, very concerned about this. So I don't know how big of a deal this story actually was in Australia, because I'm not in Australia, but pretty sure people haven't heard of this at all in New Zealand or probably the US. This guy went and he basically ratted out the Chinese to the Australians, told them how the identities of their officers in Hong Kong, gave details about how they funded operations in the city, Taiwan and Australia, and then he wound up dead. Poor guy, right? I mean, it's not easy out there to be a whistleblower, right? Okay, what else have we got here? Register tracks Chinese foreign investment in Australia and shows where the money ends up. So this one is saying that it drops, but from 2014 to 2017, there was more than $40 billion invested of Chinese money invested in Australia. That's a pretty decent amount of money for Australia. It wouldn't be big for the US, but for Australia, $40 billion is a lot. In 2016, $14.9 billion. And this is the states that it's going to, so it's almost entirely going into New South Wales and Victoria. And it's almost entirely going into urban areas of those states, which is really interesting when you look at the vastness of those of the land that they're holding onto, right? Of those pastoral holdings, this is massive. And then that's actually doesn't even move the needle in the graph because how much they own of the cities is so huge. Part of the difficulty tracking the investors are scattered. They've trawled through thousands of transactions, a growing amount being funneled into the services sector, almost nothing going into public administration and safety. So this is where the money's getting spent on, right? Mining, massive amounts into mining, 50% of all the investment. Electricity, so that's what they want to get the electricity. Transport, postal and warehousing assets. Rental, hiring, real estate services, and healthcare and social assistance. So it's hard to say, does it come from individuals in China or does it come from the Communist Party itself, right? And according to the study, the government was in less than 20% of the transactions. So it's like a 5-for-1 kind of matching going on there. Okay, so moving on, I just want to show a quick video about HAARP. Stupid ad. Okay, we can skip the ad.
Built by the Air Force about 20 years ago to study the ionosphere, to do active experiments in the ionosphere. The ionosphere is a layer that surrounds the Earth at about 100 kilometers up to maybe 2,000 kilometers. It's important for a lot of things like satellite communication. Any kind of radio signals that pass through the ionosphere are affected by the ionosphere. Each of these trailers you see around me have transmitters in them. The transmitters feed power from the main building over there up into these dipole antennas. And basically there are 180 antennas radiating high frequency waves up in the ionosphere. It's a big ham radio, a big HF radio, the biggest in the world. Fundamentally what this is about is taking the ionosphere at 100 kilometers up and turning it into a lab.
Just pause out there for Lepo's still in the chat. That's a nice one for Dave Acton, huh? The world's biggest ham radio. But notice, right, that yes, it broadcasts at high frequency, but it's also the intensity, the amount of power that they're able to pump into these systems and transmit and focus at certain areas of the Earth.
Laboratory. We can do experiments. We can create bubbles. We can heat small sections. We can create waves. We can excite plasma resonances and do a lot of experiments. We can transmit signals all around the world. We can study effects of the ionosphere. It basically makes the ionosphere a laboratory, and we can do experiments that no one else can do. It's a laboratory without walls.
Right. So the ionosphere is a laboratory without walls that they can do experiments on. Right. So this is it. I mean, they're fully admitting weather modification. Now, I believe personally that HAARP the American HAARP at least has gone into space now. But this thing here, the SBX sea-based X-band radar, you can actually see this if you go to Hawaii. You can quite often see it parked in Pearl Harbor or somewhere nearby. And it actually goes out to sea with this radar dome on it. So is this purely for surveillance? I don't know. Does it have, any antenna that they're using to listen, they can pump energy into it and use it to transmit as well. That's my opinion of it. I'm not saying I'm an expert in it. But Australia has stuff like this as well. And this thing called JORN, the Jindalee Operational Radar Network, it's an over-the-horizon radar that monitors air and sea movement. So as you can see from this map here, is that coming through right on the stream? Actually, yeah, but it's coming through great. It covers, most of the top part of Australia. That's, the bit where Australia interfaces into Asia. And that's the bit that we're concerned about. In Australia, we're not really so worried about vessels coming from the United States and New Zealand. That's the friendlies. We're worried about people coming from this direction. And so, this is supposedly for air defence. This thing, but an over-the-horizon radar. Look at this. It says Project G-Bung, Phase 1, carried out a series of ionospheric soundings, evaluating the suitability of the ionosphere for the operation of an over-the-horizon radar. So this facility is doing stuff in the ionosphere, right? And they're probably not going to tell you all of the things that it actually does. But it's in March 2018, $1.2 billion upgrade that will take 10 years to complete. And it's cost $1.8 billion so far. So they're talking about maybe a Phase 5 is going to be $70 million, and then Phase 6, $1.2 billion. So a lot of cash going into this thing. And possibly purely just for air defence, it's possible, but I think more likely it's involved in some of the ionospheric stuff as well. And then this one here, the Harold E. Holt Naval Station in Exmouth, Western Australia. Planes have actually crashed and had anomalies and had things go wrong with them in the vicinity of this facility. But look at the shape here. This isn't that someone has drawn this thing over the dish or anything. This is the actual shape of it. This crazy hexagon and another hexagon inside it, and then stuff in the middle of that looks like CERN. This is some pretty full on stuff. So, Australia does have its own versions of this HAARP technology at bases, and there's a lot of HAARP-like things all around the world. This is one picture of when the Harold Holt, the Exmouth facility, was first installed. This is the sort of radar antennas they were doing. So they've become a lot more sophisticated than these wires being strung together then. But look how tiny the power plant is. And the transmitter building, the helix building at the middle, compared to the size of the poles and those fuel storage tanks at the bottom right corner. When you see those tanks in in real life, you see how massive they are, right? they're huge. They're the size of like 6-7 story building or more maybe. So that gives you an idea of the scale of this freaking thing, right? Now, and here's an interesting map of other HAARP facilities that there are around the world. Now, this is just stuff downloaded from the internet, and classified ionospheric research stations. Should I have to be the world expert on those to do it like a YouTube stream on it? I don't think so. So this is stuff from the internet. Do your own research. I've no reason to believe anything in this map is wrong. But it's saying that they have them in Norway. There's one in Long Island. There's one at Area 51. There's one in Puerto Rico, Peru, Brazil, India, China, Russia, Australia, Japan. And then this map is kind of interesting. It's sort of the last map, but being overlaid with the chakras of the earth. And that there are apparently, sacred sites of the earth that represent the earth's chakras and are connected together with ley lines. And, there is some correlation or overlap between the location of these HAARP facilities around the world and places like Glastonbury, Uluru, Ezrock, and the Olgas in Australia, the Four Mountains of Bali, Table Mountain in Cape Town, Mount Shasta. It says Maui in Hawaii. I don't know why it wouldn't be Kauai. But I mean, anyway, how do you scientifically prove that anything like that's true? It's just basically a theory, right? And then now this map is showing the Pacific Ocean. So you got the United States over there, top right corner. You got China over there, top left corner. Then Japan. Although Japan is a fairly small amount of land, economically it's a massive, massive economy. Much bigger than Australia. So Australia's biggest trading partners are actually China and Japan. At least it was when I lived there. I haven't looked at it in 2019. Maybe that's different now. But and then you can see us down the bottom there, little old New Zealand, and Australia, and in between all these different island nations. And these island nations are all like quite small places, quite small populations and economies on their own. But as a region, it's really quite an important strategic region. And the Chinese are projecting their presence throughout this entire region. The allegation made in the 60 Minutes video is bribes of $1 million to politicians. The allegation made in the story we just saw was, a young 32-year-old car dealer being offered $1 million to run for a parliament seat, basically as an agent of a foreign power. So there's a lot of stuff going on with this. So I'm getting now towards the end of the stream, I think. Just maybe half a dozen more articles to go through. And so now we're talking about the US-China battle for dominance, which extends across the Pacific above and below the sea. So this is even the Mariana Islands and the Mariana Trench, right? Which this is the deepest part of the Earth that we know of, is this Marianas Trench. And there's all kinds of deep sea research going on in there. China is trying to take this over and make it, that they have the influence over the trench. So the Mariana Islands are CNMI, something North Mariana Island, I guess. Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands is CNMI, and Guam. They were once seen as the tip of the spear of American power projection. Let me just bring that map in for you guys again. So this area, these Northern Marianas, like Saipan and Guam and that, it's right next to Japan, right next to the Philippines, right next to Hong Kong, and right next to China. So you can see why this is like very strategically important, and why it would have been considered as this tip of the spear. And also they had what was once the world's most lucrative casino. wars and conflicts never start on Fifth Avenue. They start in places of limited strategic consequence, such as the Mariana Islands. That's where great powers rub up against each other. It's a 15-hour flight from California and just 5 hours from Beijing, and it's the deepest point of the planet. So China's activity and influence has increased significantly, and they're doing undersea exploration. So there's 2 US military bases on Guam, and the residents serving in the military is a rate 3 times higher than any state of the US. They have the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense, the THAAD, anti-ballistic missile system there, which is the same system they have in Korea, or South Korea. And it's a target for North Korean nuclear threats. Okay, so in October, China's Tan Suo-1 deep-sea research mission returned from the Mariana Trench, where it successfully operated an unpiloted glider for 46 continuous days at a depth of 7,000 metres, an unprecedented duration at unprecedented depth, according to Chinese media. So they also tested the first magnesium seawater fuel cell to operate at 10,000 metres below the sea, 10 kilometres, so what's that, 7 miles, 6 miles, and live stream video from a robot at that depth. The tests indicate China's gliders can collect data useful in anti-detection efforts for its submarine fleet and help the People's Liberation Army Navy address one of its biggest challenges. So these robots are running on a magnesium seawater fuel cell. So I don't know how long that means they can operate for, right? Like it could be a long, long time. At an incredible depth, right? 10,000 metres below the sea. This is below where I'd say, any Western Navy submarine is operating, right? Military vehicles anyway. And they've got robots and drones down at the very, very bottom of the ocean. Doing what? Mapping? Looking for fish? I don't know. But they want to be able to navigate submarines undetected from the waters between the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, out to the second, which includes the Mariana Islands. So China needs to get past Japan and the Philippines to get to the rest of the Pacific. This expert, Goldstein, says, I've been working in undersea warfare for 20 years. I've never encountered serious thinking about what a military will want to do at 5,000 metres or lower. So 10,000 metres is way lower than that, right? Because China's military now has become more globally active, they're going to need more supporting bases overseas. It's very possible in the future they will have some bases in the Pacific Island region, right? So bases where these like super deep submarine drones can go. China is running research vessels everywhere. One major impetus is for economic development. On the other hand, there's strong military and strategic reasons to pursue this course. China understands there's a very wide crossover between military and civilian technology when it comes to oceanography. Yeah, so this is the Chinese research vessel coming back from the Mariana Trench, dropping its robots and drones down there. And so then you've also got Indonesia, which is a large power, the largest Muslim nation. So then have a look at this. The Best Sunshine Casino, run by Hong Kong's Imperial Pacific, under construction at Saipan. Their 16 VIP tables turned over $3.9 billion a month in 2016, compared to the world's biggest casino, the Venetian Macau, which did $2.5 billion a month on 102 VIP tables. So 16 tables. So this, what's going on in Saipan, this tiny place where it is the most lucrative casino in the world. It's just under 4,000 kilometers from Beijing, 12,500 from Washington. And it's sort of been neglected a bit from America, is what this article is saying. 80% of the island, Tinian, the third most populated island in the Marianas, is still without power. And in 2010, the entire island fell below the US poverty line. So you can see China doesn't have to splash a lot of cash in this place to make a really big difference and to basically get loyalty and these strategic reasons. Complacency is a luxury Washington does not have. Well, I hope they're actively dealing with this situation. So the other thing about Saipan that's really interesting is this story of the shadow billionaire. And I'm sure it must be all right for me to play a trailer, right? If I just play a trailer in a YouTube window for their movie. Can you guys see that all right?
You have to trace globalism to Larry Hillblum.
He was the founder of a huge corporation, DHL.
Did you hear what they just said? You have to trace globalism to Larry Hillblum. So this guy is like one of the founders of the globalists, of globalism, right? He's the H out of DHL. Or maybe it's the L. I think it's the H.
What came out in the weeks after his disappearance shocked even those who thought they knew him.
He told me about his relationships with women. He would only have sex with virgins, and the millions of dollars that this had cost him because he didn't want to get AIDS.
It all was kind of shocking.
God, this is...
So this dude, right, he lives in Saipan, which turns out is kind of a bit like the Philippines, that there's just all kinds of these dancing girl bars there where the girls are like underage, and some of them have come straight from villages where they've never even seen running water before. He tells them to take a shower and they don't know what that is. They don't know how to turn it on or operate that device, right? They've never seen that device before. And this guy, he's a multi-billionaire, the founder of DHL, right, living in this Saipan. He only wants to have virgins. So that's part of his test, is put them in the bathroom and see if they go straight to turn the shower on. And then these virgins, he wants to have sex with them without condoms on, right? And he feels that's safe and he's never going to get AIDS because they're virgins. And what happens is that many of these chicks got pregnant, right? And then the guy disappeared in a plane crash, and he's got all these, claims on his fortune, which is, locked up in a series of trusts.
Cash, crime, and those are the three C's. Clearly, the Larry Hillblum story incorporated all three elements.
Larry cut a wide swath through the Pacific.
His name is Junior Larry Hillbloom. Kaylani Kinney claims he's actually Hillblum's illegitimate son. If they can prove that in court, he would become one of the richest little boys in the entire world.
They came to this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific.
It turned into a real circus with dozens of attorneys.
Trying to grab a piece of it. There's a lot of money there.
Where big money is concerned, people do follow.
These guys want you to believe that it's just a probate case. It's not a probate case, it's a criminal case.
I wasn't suspicious really before that.
Things aren't always what they appear to be.
So anyway, that's a really good documentary, Shadow Billionaire. I really recommend that, and that's all about this place, Saipan, and what the hell was this DHL billionaire guy doing there? Was it just that he's a pedo, or was it more to do with the international logistics business, being the founder of logistics for the globalists, and running one of the world's biggest logistics companies? Is there some sort of secret squirrel stuff going on there? Understanding China's military expansion. China for many years was basically kept within its own borders and it wasn't really an expansionist power. Genghis Khan, he was Mongolian, so technically not Chinese, but he was ruler of China in his era. So this is a presentation by Patricia Kim in 2018 to the Select Committee on Intelligence of the House of Representatives. And they talk about China is increasing the size of its Navy and Air Force while reducing its ground troops by 300,000. And they're establishing a strategic support force that focuses on space, cyber, and electronic warfare. The PLA has been tasked by the party to accelerate the development of military intelligence with a focus on emerging technologies and especially artificial intelligence, as critical tools for modern warfare. And then the Chinese government's called on commercial and defense industries to work together to strengthen the military, a drive for civil-military fusion, part of Beijing's largest strategy of its Made in China 2025 initiative. So civil-military fusion sounds like fascism, sounds like Terminator. They're investing $1 trillion in infrastructure across 60 countries as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. So what's happening in the Pacific is happening as part of this broader geostrategic plan, right? So it's not just that they're doing the Belt and Road, trying to connect a land bridge through Eurasia from China to Europe, but they're also trying to expand out into the Pacific region as well. That's a little dry, this one. So this island off the Solomon Islands called Tulagi, China just took over the entire island. There's 1,000 residents here. This is how they live. They ride their canoes that they make from trees. They go fishing, you know. These people have lived this way for a very long time. It was a natural deep water harbour, which makes it a military gem. So China's coming in to take control, and it's a secretive deal with a provincial government of the Solomon Islands, Beijing company, close ties to the Chinese Communist Party. And they're saying that the Chinese strategy is basically debt traps for developing nations, which, you know, the West has done this in, the privatization of state assets that's what Confessions of an Economic Hitman is all about. But now the Chinese are doing the same thing. They're coming in, they lend the politicians a lot of money, they get big, shiny, gleaming projects, and then they have no ability to repay the loans. So, you know, China ends up owning the complete asset and, you know, penalty payments and everything like that. The geography tells you that this is a good location. So there it is on the map there, the Solomon Islands, very close to Australia and New Zealand and Fiji, Papua New Guinea. Great place to have your, long-range bombers and stuff like that if you want to hit Australia. They say Beijing could be establishing a military foothold, everything from ships to planes, and its own version of the GPS system. So as part of this deal, the Solomon Islands cuts ties to Taipei, and then Kiribati followed suit the second week. And then they have a wharf in Vanuatu that supposedly is built so that Chinese aircraft carriers can dock into it. US-China battle for dominance. I think I read that one. Okay. So Japan, US, and Australia are pushing back on China's South Pacific expansion. This is from July 2019. So it's a war of nerves involving Japan, US, Australia, and China, and it's over island nations like Palau, Fiji, and the Cook Islands. Attention focused on crucial sea lanes in the region. The Japanese want a free and open Indo-Pacific. With security of ocean routes from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They want to check China, which is expanding its presence in the area. China envisions a line of defense from Japan's southern Ogasawara Islands to Papua New Guinea via Guam and Saipan as its second island chain strategy. So China doesn't want to just navigate through these islands, it wants these islands, right? All these islands where this DHL dude's living, and that'll be China's now, with this most lucrative casino in the world. Vanuatu building a large port reportedly for use by the Chinese Navy, although the two countries deny the report. And you can see this is the sea lanes for Japan's oil imports from the Middle East, so absolutely vital for Japan's economy. and then the sea lane for coal and iron ore from Australia, again, absolutely vital for Australia's economy. I mean, we could get our oil coming in from the United States and Mexico in worst case scenarios. If South America, Venezuela is a big oil producer, but we need somewhere for our coal and iron ore to go, and if we don't have that, our economy falls apart. So, yeah, growing strategic importance. China throwing their money around. Concern about the sea lanes. And now these islands meeting with Japan and stuff as well. So everyone's starting to chip in. Like, it's like, I guess Trump doesn't want to fund the whole bill himself. So he's like, hey, Japan, you pay a bit. Australia, you pay a bit, whatever. I don't know how well that strategy is going to work against China, because I think these people are easily bribed. And I think China has a lot of money and a lot of demands to make this happen. So there's another good detailed map of the Pacific Islands. So, when you look at the main map of the world, it looks like a huge area of ocean with nothing really in it between Hawaii and New Zealand. But in fact, when you look at this, there's actually tons and tons of islands all through these oceans, and around them, oil and gas, offshore resources, fisheries resources, potentially mining and undersea mining. I think is going to be a growing thing in the future. The Pacific Islands is 300,000 square kilometres of land. And of the land, 80% of that is actually Papua New Guinea. And the area of the Pacific Ocean that represents the Pacific Islands is 52 million square kilometres. And this is basically the front lines of climate change. The populations in Papua New Guinea, Fiji's got less than 1 million people, 926,000. Solomon Islands, 660,000. Vanuatu, 288,000, and Samoa 201,000. So you've heard about those measles deaths in Samoa. That's coming off a very small population to begin with. And then in terms of land, Papua New Guinea's got most of the land. Solomon Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu, then Samoa. So China's promised a lot of aid but not delivered. Australia's actually been given an enormous amount of aid to the region. So $6.58 billion of aid from Australia, 1.26 from China, 1.21 from New Zealand, 1.03 from USA, and 0.86 from Japan. So, luckily Australia is kind of carrying the burden for everybody else there. But, China is already in the number 2 aid position, and the US is only number 4. All right, and I think I've got one more story to go through. That Chinese outreach to Pacific states is gaining steam. So from 2011 to 2019, China provided $1.47 billion in concessional loans to Pacific Island states. And if it pays up to everything that it's pledged to do, it might actually overtake Australia as the region's top donor. So they're basically just buying this part of the earth, right? And it's costing them $1.5 billion, like one of Donald Trump's properties potentially, to own this part of the earth. So I hope that, people out there in the Northern Hemisphere are taking note of this, are paying attention. I'd much rather have the American, European, Judeo-Christian way of life over this massive region of the earth. That was been settled and developed by missionaries who invested in education system and hospital systems for these nations, and needs further investment in that, And I think the Chinese are welcome and the Japanese are welcome for sure come, but I don't think that they should be able to just buy their way to owning everything and then culturally dominating everything. All right, well, thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. Really appreciate it. I obviously don't have any evidence that the Chinese HAARP has anything to do with volcanoes in New Zealand or fires in Australia. But I have, I've shown that HAARP-like technology is capable of causing volcanoes, fires, earthquakes. droughts and floods. And I've shown that China has these large-scale weather modification technologies and is widely acknowledged as having used them before. So how would we even know if this was going on? How would we know it wasn't us doing it to ourselves, or a friendly nation, a nation we thought was friendly, that also has this plan of destroy the land, destroy the farms, destroy the real estate values, buy it all up on the cheap, and then suddenly, turn the deserts green. Anyway, it'd be very interesting to see how the rest of the century plays out. I think Australia is one of the biggest geoengineering prizes that's out there. There's obviously a lot of stuff to do in Africa as well, but because Australia is so close to Asia and so close to large population centres, and also the best place in the world for solar energy and stuff, very good for wind energy, has a lot of the resources it needs self-sufficiency wise. Australia is a huge prize, and if someone could get areas of land the size of those Kidman cattle stations and suddenly manipulate the weather and the rain to turn that into fertile, productive agricultural land, those people would be making hundreds of billions of dollars, I would think, possibly trillions of dollars. Yep, thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you guys all on